NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg has signaled support for Ukrainian membership in the alliance, saying the country could join, quote, when allies agree and conditions are met. But NATO leaders stopped short of offering Kyiv a concrete timeline. Before the summit, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenkyy had harsh words for the alliance, calling NATO's lack of clarity absurd.
As Russian attacks rain down on Ukraine, the country's flag flies high over Vilnius, the city playing host to NATO leaders. Ukrainian President Zelenkyy came here with a clear message. He wants concrete commitments from the alliance. Ukraine will make NATO stronger. Ukraine has long harboured ambitions of joining NATO. Though leaders have agreed to remove some barriers to entry, Kyiv's hopes of securing a timeline for accession have been dashed.
We reaffirmed that Ukraine will become a member of NATO and agreed to remove the requirement for a membership action plan. This would change Ukraine's membership path from a two-step process to a one-step process. We also made clear that we will issue an invitation for Ukraine to join NATO when allies agree and conditions are met.
For months, NATO nations have been haggling over when and how Ukraine should be invited to join the alliance. They say it won't happen while the war rages, because that could bring NATO into direct conflict with Russia. But some Eastern European and Baltic countries are calling for a clearer path for Kyiv.
Ukraine is using the equipment that the allies are giving and the ammunition, so it is already ticking those boxes. So what more can we do in order to really go to that membership?
Germany and the United States have been more cautious, keeping the focus on future security assurances. It is important for us from the outset that there are security pledges for Ukraine that can be effective after peace. That could include individual pledges to offer Ukraine support in case of further attacks, but not to fight for the country. At least one announcement at the summit will see Kyiv's ambitions take flight. Several nations, including the Netherlands and Denmark, agreed to start training Ukrainian pilots on Western-made fighter jets later this year.
And we're now joined by DW Russia analyst Konstantin Egad, who joins us from Vilnius. Konstantin, is this really the best NATO leaders could offer Ukraine at the moment?
Well, it seems that this is the best compromise they could reach, Nicole, and no more than that. Indeed, during the war, it was very difficult to imagine that Ukraine will be invited sort of to join the alliance. But what the Ukrainians, the Central Europeans and the Baltic countries really wanted is some kind of more or less clear roadmap or timeline. And this is lacking. And because of that, frankly speaking, it starts to look very much like Bucharest 2008 again. And I've been there and frankly, I see, well, just a bit of difference.
What is the difference from Bucharest, where NATO declared that Ukraine would eventually be able to join the alliance?
In political terms, pretty much none. There is still no timeline, and the conditions are pretty vague. You can say that Ukraine is not ready basically as long as you want. The only real thing is the removal of a demand for a membership action plan, which is a preparatory stage before joining NATO. It usually lasts, well, 2, 3, 4 years. Now Ukraine will not have to go through that. But the problem is that you don't know when Ukraine is going to go through that. And this is something that I think will have an impact on the future of the war with Russia and, frankly speaking, on the future of the alliance.
NATO members are very hesitant to offer a set timeline to Ukraine, and it is one of the central demands that Zelenkyy brought to the summit. What are the reasons for caution here? Why can't NATO say, OK, once the war stops, we can initiate these steps?
Well, once you speak to, diplomats and officials on the sort of, if you want, in the corridors of the summit, it's very clear that one of the reasons is the situation in the United States. The Biden administration is under increasing pressure from isolationist wings of the Republican Party and its own Democratic Party, which essentially says that United States should withdraw from the world and try to avoid any kind of involvement in military conflicts. And in the run-up to the election year, many people here are saying Joe Biden, US president, is extremely cautious not to be seen as quote-unquote a warmonger, someone who can accidentally draw the US into the conflict with Russia, which could become nuclear. Other experts here are saying that it's quite unlikely that Russia will go for a nuclear confrontation with NATO, but still caution reigns here in Vilnius.
The Kremlin has said it will closely watch this summit. How might this be playing out in Moscow, you think?
Well, frankly speaking, my suspicion, my personal take is that Putin will kind of breathe a sign of relief. Nothing dramatic happened. Probably they expected it. They have their sources. Whether it will have an impact on the prosecution of the war by the Russians, I think it will, because frankly, this indefinite sort of unclear time frame pushes Putin to extend the war as long as possible, to make it protracted in order to delay Ukraine's accession to NATO for as long as possible. So this will be a political and I'm afraid military logic, the military logic of Moscow in the coming months and who knows, probably years.
DW's Konstantin Eckert in Vilnius. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Let's move on and get the Ukrainian perspective and bring in Alexander Sherba. He's a Ukrainian diplomat. He served as ambassador to Austria until 2021. Today, he's the ambassador for strategic communications at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Mr. Sherba, welcome to DW. President Zelenkyy says it's absurd that NATO doesn't establish a clear timeline for Ukraine's membership. How do you feel about the declaration?
Well, I won't lie, it's kind of disappointment, quite frankly, considering that NATO's policy towards Ukraine, let's be honest, was one history, one big lie over the last 2 decades at least. People spoke and said that the doors to Ukraine are open, but in reality, everybody knew that they aren't, because that was the way of NATO to not to escalate and not to provoke Russia. And our hope was that after it became so obvious that this policy of, appeasing a bully has failed, after a year and a half of Ukraine basically doing NATO's job and defending Europe and providing security to Europe in the face of this mad Russia. And after 23 countries of NATO supported a clear timeline for Ukraine's NATO accession, we thought it would be a little bit more than in this final statement of the summit.
So why do you think the communiqué is so vague? What is NATO afraid of, and who within NATO is afraid?
Well, I completely agree with Konstantin. I think first of all, it's about the position of American leader, and we were extremely thankful and grateful to Joe Biden for providing all the support and all the necessary, basically taking the right position on most of Ukraine issues. But in this particular point, it sounded a little bit like continuation of an absolutely failed Obama policy. And I think tomorrow, during the inaugural meeting of the Ukraine-NATO Council, there will be a quite open conversation about it, and knowing the temperament of our president, it will be a heated discussion tomorrow.
Some argue that it's not in NATO's best interest to grant membership to Ukraine. What would Ukraine bring to the table in exchange for the alliance potentially risking an all-out war with Russia?
Well, nobody is speaking about bringing Ukraine in right now because we are at war with Russia. We are speaking about opening a door and finding something more tangible and clear than all these, mantras from the past that turned out to be shallow and empty.
Why should you become a member, though? Sorry to interrupt you there.
Excuse me?
Why should Ukraine become a member? What would they bring into the alliance?
Aside from the strongest army in Europe, aside from the population that absolutely adamantly believes in NATO, aside from proving that we are protecting and fighting and bleeding for the values of NATO. Well, all these things plus, I don't know, it will be NATO's credibility.
What would you hope to get as a member that you're not already getting now?
First of all, after the war ends, there will be a huge effort on rebuilding Ukraine, of course, and no sane, cautious investor would invest in a country that doesn't have a certain security umbrella over it. And NATO's fifth article is the most tangible thing to provide such umbrella.
Mm-hmm. You seem very disappointed. So does President Zelenskyy. What's the way forward now?
Well, most important thing is, of course, that both the NATO and Ukraine are moving ahead. The 23 countries of the NATO have clearly stated what they want. I think tomorrow the meeting of the Council will also show the overwhelming majority of the countries really wanting to, leave in the past this policy of, hypocrisy towards Ukraine. And as open and real partners to each other, we should be moving ahead first to winning this war, and second to making Europe a more secure, more safe space.
That was Ukrainian diplomat Alexander Sherba. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And we can develop the story further with Justin Logan. He's the Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute think tank. He specializes in U.S. grand strategy and U.S. foreign policy. Welcome to the day. Let's dive right in. No clear path to NATO membership for Ukraine at this point. In your opinion, should Kyiv receive an invitation to join the alliance?
No, I think that the decision itself not to extend a meaningful pathway to membership for Ukraine was correct. I actually agree with President Zelenskyy and the ambassador that was just on the show that there has been a considerable amount of double talk and sort of leading Ukraine along to believe that it will someday become a member. But substantively, the Western allies, the United States, Germany, and France have revealed that they don't believe they have an interest in Ukraine worth fighting Russia over. And given that the Article 5 commitment, as Joe Biden has recently put it, is a so-called sacred commitment to treat an attack on one member of NATO as an attack on all, we shouldn't extend a security guarantee to a country we've just revealed we don't believe we have an interest in fighting over.
Let's talk about when Ukraine becomes a member, because at this point, it seems to be a matter of when and not if. Do you think that would deter Russia from future aggressions?
Well, I'm not sure that it is a matter of when and not if at this point. I mean, it's hard to predict 20 years down the road, but I think for the policy relevant future, it's terribly unlikely that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. As to the question of whether Article 5 would actually deter Russia, to kind of go back to the point that I made previously, credibility is a sort of witchy thing, right? It's difficult to quantify. It's difficult to make a commitment credible. And given that in the very recent past, in the present, in fact, we've revealed that we don't believe we have an interest in fighting Russia and Ukraine. President Biden calls such a prospect World War III. There's reason to fear that the Russian president or any Russian leader would say, look, the Americans have said that this would be World War III, and under no circumstances are they going to fight for Ukraine. So why would we credit an Article 5 commitment to Ukraine? And then I think there's a risk that were that to happen, you'd have other very vulnerable countries like the Baltic states, for example, wondering, hey, wait a minute, which kind of Article 5 guarantee do we have? Do we have the kind that France and Germany had? France had during the Cold War, and Germany had starting in West Germany had starting in the 50s? Or do we have some other Ukraine type Article 5 guarantee that means something completely different?
So what you're implying is that NATO would never stand up to Russia, or NATO would just never stand up to Russia in Ukraine under Article 5?
It's a Ukraine question, right? If we granted an Article 5 security guarantee to Ukraine and Russia were to attack it, we would have really two choices, right? React as though Article 5 is a sacred commitment. And as President Biden has said, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory, if you'll forgive the imperial measurement. So that would lead to the prospect of a direct NATO-Russia shooting war with the potential for nuclear escalation were we to stand by the commitment. If we were to renege on the commitment and say, well, we'll just send some materiel and money and things, but we're not actually going to fight for Ukraine, then you'd have many other NATO members saying, would the Americans fight for us? Would the Germans fight for us? And I think that is the uncomfortable underlying reality that we face in this sort of strange discussion about admitting Ukraine to NATO.
So what do you think is behind these vague promises of not now, but later, if, in your opinion, there is no real interest of ever including Ukraine in the alliance?
That's a very good question, and I don't have a good answer to it, because in an article that I published last week, said, the honorable thing to do would be, if you have no intention of doing something, plainly admit we're not going to do this, so that Ukraine won't have the possibility of engaging in wishful thinking or hearing what it wants to hear. But they continue to sort of dangle this prospect out there, and I don't know why they're doing it. I think it is. I understand quite clearly why the Ukrainian leadership is frustrated. And it's just my hope that they will kind of read between the lines and understand that this is conceived of in some Western capitals as the kind of polite way to say no, when in fact, I think it's actually quite dangerous and disingenuous.
It is very dangerous, and you can see that there is a lot of disappointment on the Ukrainian side right now. I want to get back to something that you said before, that it's not, in the United States' interest to see Ukraine included in NATO. But NATO was created to deter Soviet expansionism, stop the revival of nationalist militarism in Europe through a strong North American presence, and to encourage European political integration. Now, let's pull all of these principles into the 21st century. Would Ukrainian accession not fit right into this mission?
NATO was founded at a time when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. If you had told policymakers in 1949 or 1950, we're going to keep this thing rolling until Ukraine is a member, they'd have said you were out of your mind. U.S. policy in Europe historically has been counter-hegemonic. The United States' interest is to prevent one country from dominating Europe. So World War I, World War II, the Cold War, these were all scenarios in which there was a prospect that Germany twice and the Soviet Union once could have dominated the European continent. Even if Russia were to conquer all of Ukraine, if it took all of Ukraine without a shot having been fired, its GDP would have gone up by 10%, making it roughly the size of Italy's, and it would have had a second major port on the Black Sea. That does not put Russia in a position to dominate Europe, or even really to threaten Germany or Poland, given the terrible military performance the Russians have had in the first 17 months of the war. So my view as an American is that our interest in Ukraine is limited. It's particularly limited as contrasted with Ukraine's interest in Ukraine, which is almost unlimited. And that's why you heard the Ukrainians last spring, for example, calling for the U.S. to enter the war via a no-fly zone. The U.S. politely declined, and a number of things where the Ukrainians have actually tried to escalate and bring the United States in, right? When a surface-to-air missile from Ukraine landed in Poland,
we
they blamed it on the Russians.
only have a couple of seconds left, but I do want to ask you, if national interest really reigns supreme, what's the point in being in an alliance?
Well, NATO was founded at a point when it was very plausible that the Soviets could have come in and taken the industrial heartland of Europe for itself. So I think there was a very plausible argument that we needed to prevent the Soviet Union from dominating Europe. It's just that Russia can't dominate. This Russia can't dominate Europe today.
All right. Justin Logan, Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Many thanks.
And we'll take you straight to the Ukrainian capital as Vladimir Zelenkyy is to attend the NATO summit, even though Ukraine is not a member. Our correspondent in Kiev, Nick Connolly, can talk us through this summit's significance for Ukraine. Welcome, Nick. So let's start with today's angry tweet from President Zelenkyy describing the signals he's been getting from NATO leaders as absurd.
Well, look, going into this summit, he made it very clear that he wouldn't just turn up and smile politely for the cameras and say thank you for the aid that Ukraine has received. He said he would only go in person if there were real concrete results for Ukraine. And there's a sense that he had been led to believe that more would happen, that now it looks likely will be given to Ukraine in terms of firm guarantees, in terms of a timeline for joining as soon as the war is over. Now there's talk of just a formal invitation rather than a timeline to full membership, and that is obviously something that has got him very angry. I think there's a real sense here in Ukraine that these are just basically made-up reasons to try and kind of kick the can in the hope that once the rockets, the bombs have stopped falling on civilians here in Ukraine, that the pressure will be off to take Ukraine and to kind of show some kind of openness and solidarity with Ukraine. This is not about getting Ukraine to change. This is just a kind of time-wasting tactic from countries that don't want to see Ukraine in the alliance.
Right. So let's look at today's meeting then. Two questions in one. What does Ukraine want from the summit, and what's it likely to get?
Well, as for the wants, I think it's clear, and no one was really expecting here that they would join while the fighting continues as it has, but they were certainly looking for a time frame, and a shorter time frame than anyone would have thought possible before this war. They point to Finland and Sweden and say this is essentially a political decision. If you want us, you can take us. Stop trying to claim that this is all about technicalities. When you talk about governance and rule of law, they point to Hungary, they point to Turkey and say these are countries that have lots of questions about their governance, and yet they are full members of the alliance, and there is no question of them being thrown out for that. So there's a real sense that Ukraine needs a clear path to NATO membership, and they say that as soon as that happens, Russia will basically leave off, that this doesn't escalate, this just makes it clear to the Kremlin that the West is with Ukraine in the long haul. As for what it's going to get, I think it's still pretty much open. It seems like that tweet from Zelensky was part of an attempt to kind of up the ante and to maybe try and push for more than was seemingly going to come out of this summit. I think there are lots of different briefings coming out from different delegations with all slightly different spins on what's going to be given. So I think there is a sense that there is still going to be a lot of pressure, especially on Germany, that has once again come out as the most cautious on Ukrainian NATO membership, to try and push their position towards some kind of more clear guarantee that Ukraine will indeed become a full member, rather than just cooperating, rather than just receiving military aid.
Right. Ukrainian people got a lot on their hands at the moment with this war going on. Is Ukrainian membership of NATO something that is particularly at the front of their minds, especially given it's been under discussion since, what, 2008?
Well, if you look at the polls, there's about 90% support for NATO membership in Ukraine now since this full-scale invasion from Russia happened in 2020. That is significantly up on the already majority, kind of pre-existing majority of support for NATO membership. And when you talk to people, they will say that Russia basically only understands force. That is the kind of consensus opinion here in Ukraine. And that, Israel-style guarantees are all well and good, but they say Israel has much weaker, much more fragmented neighbours. It doesn't have a nuclear power directly on its borders that is trying to retake its territory, and that Ukraine needs that full NATO membership. They were given guarantees of safety in the 90s when they gave up their own nuclear weapons. The US, France, Russia, the UK all signed up to that, and in the end they did nothing when Crimea happened. They did comparatively little at the beginning of this war. So there's a real sense here that anything short of that Article 5 guarantee of American, British, Polish, German troops on the ground is not enough. And they say we can win this war maybe now, we can push the Russian troops back, but with that constant threat and that kind of ambiguity hanging over our heads, that will just invite a new attempt from the Russians 2, 3, 5 years down the line, and that will also disencourage people who have maybe left the country to come back. Without that kind of clear security framework, they say this is a country that doesn't have a future.
Nick, you've clearly been wading through the minutiae of this. People watching this will say, well, Ukraine is in the middle of the war. Of course, NATO is not going to allow them to become a member. You don't get to take out insurance while your roof is on fire. So, given the declarations that we've heard and the warm words that we've heard from NATO, what in there is it that President Zelensky thinks that he's been deceived about? Because I think watching from the outside, it seems not unreasonable. NATO says, when the conditions are right, in you come. Now, clearly there's a war going on, so conditions aren't right. What more does he want?
So he wants timings. He wants a roadmap with kind of hard and fast guarantees. OK, the fighting stops in this and this form, then you have half a year to do this, and then another 6 months later you are a member. That is kind of as detailed as they want. That memory of the 2008 Bucharest NATO summit, when basically Ukraine and Georgia got some warm words that enraged the Kremlin but did nothing to protect either Georgia or Ukraine, that is still very much alive, especially in the minds of politicians and experts here. Some politicians, we had a German foreign policy expert in the Bundestag coming out saying that maybe NATO could guarantee Ukrainian territory that is not currently the site of fighting, say that, you know, basically anything behind the current Ukrainian front lines counts as NATO territory. That was pretty controversial, but is an option. But I think right now what is really getting people nervous here in Kiev is that they are suggesting they will talk about a potential invitation rather than potential membership. Basically, more bureaucracy, more unclear kind of timelines that could see basically this being put on the kind of back burner for years to come without any real potential to join.
OK, thanks for that, Nick. Correspondent Nick Connolly in Kiev. Well, let's look at where Germany stands on this issue. Dietmar Nitan is a member of the German Parliament for Chancellor Scholz's Social Democrats. He also sits on the Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. Welcome to DW. When should Ukraine become a NATO member?
As fast as it is possible, in a framework that makes this NATO accession a success story, and therefore we need fulfilling conditions. But to be honest, I can understand the disappointment on the Ukrainian side, but on the other side, unity in NATO is the best weapon to protect Ukraine. And I think we are now at the point where we have unity that we want to see Ukraine in the NATO, but we need to prepare some details of a roadmap to present it then also in public.
You've had since 2000, or NATO has had since 2008 to prepare a roadmap for Ukraine membership. Why has it not been forthcoming?
First of all, there were also in 2008 and the following years, not every NATO member state was convinced that the track bringing Ukraine into the NATO is the best thing. The second thing is that after the beginning of the war in Crimea in 2014, and then, of course, after the beginning of the full-scale war in February 2022, in a hot conflict, in a war, you cannot make decisions about NATO membership. But again, we need this roadmap. I'm in favor to work very hard that we quickly can present it. But again, I think that Sweden now is coming into NATO, that all NATO member states agreed we want to see Ukraine in NATO, is a base we can work on, and we should do that, and we should do it very accurate and very quickly. And in that sense, I think we can make progress even out of this summit of NATO.
What conditions, then, should Ukraine fulfill in order to become a NATO member? You don't have to go through the whole list, but give us your top three, say.
I think what is very important is that we can bring in Ukraine in our security architecture. Now they must work with a huge different weapon systems, and that is not something that you can do very quickly. And the second thing is that also the political framework should be clear. When is the right point to get the full membership? What are the steps that we should do there? And again, I think what we see today is not a tactical move that some NATO states don't want to see Ukraine in, and now they play on time. I think that a lot of NATO member states hesitate to be too concrete in this phase of the war. And again, we should not now, how should I say, produce more and more disappointments in Ukraine is disappointed, and on the other side, NATO member states perhaps are disappointed that Ukraine is disappointed. We should use the opportunity. The summit is going on to come at the end of the day in attendance of President Zelensky to an outcome that is something that is not that what Zelensky wants to see this day, but something what he can bring back to the Ukrainians and to say, look, they want us, there are some things to do, but we want now go together on a good track.
But all of those, let me argue from his point of view, all of those NATO could do now. All of those NATO could have done in the last year, the last 2 years, since this war started, since 2008, 15 years ago, when they were talking about Ukraine accession. His point, I was looking at his tweets today, seems to be that this continued delay gives NATO the opportunity to use Ukraine as a bargaining chip when it comes to talking peace with Russia. Is he wrong?
I cannot look behind the curtain, but I think he is wrong, because we should not bring in the security of Ukraine and the perspective of a NATO membership into talks when it comes to peace talks. It should be clear that we want to see Ukraine in NATO, and that holding them out of NATO couldn't be an issue in peace talks, because if the hot war is ended, we are in a Cold War, and in this Cold War, every day Ukraine could be attacked, and because of that, in my view, they need a clear perspective that they not only get security guarantees like an Israel status when it comes to the US, they need really at the end of the tunnel a clear perspective for NATO membership, because I agree with the Ukrainians that NATO membership is the best security guarantee they can get in the future to protect them against a second war coming from the Kremlin against the Ukrainian people.
So while Ukraine waits, while Ukraine fights this war, while Ukrainians are dying and NATO watches on and says, well, not yet, not yet, not yet, what security guarantees should Germany in particular offer Ukraine while it waits to join?
First of all, Germany should be one of the forces inside NATO that are supporting a fast track for presenting them a concrete roadmap for Ukraine, including also a time measurement. The second thing is, and Chancellor Scholz announced that Germany should work hard that, for example, also G7 is presenting their part of giving security guarantees. And the third thing is, Germany should work hard to create also outside NATO a lot of support for Ukraine when it comes to peace talks, but also when it comes to security guarantees. And we should not underestimate that, for example, the good relationships that German Social Democrats have with the Workers' Party in Brazil could be a way to convince President Lula to come to a very constructive track when it comes to Ukraine. And I think that are some puzzle pieces of that what Germany now should do.
I thank you so much for joining us and just talking us through that. German Social Democrat lawmaker Dieter Nietern. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Alexander Muller speaks on defence for the FDP group in the German parliament. The FDP is one of the coalition partners in the German government. Welcome to DW. We've heard criticism from President Zelensky today in a tweet, tweeting his frustration about the fact that NATO hasn't established a clear timeline for his country's membership. Is it absurd that NATO hasn't done this, as Mr. Zelensky says?
No, this is not absurd. I know that he is expected from his people in Ukraine to have a clear timeline, but giving him a clear timeline would be counterproductive. You know, Putin will see any concrete timeline as something where he works against it. If there would be, for example, X days after the end of the war, Ukraine would be invited into NATO, then Putin would never end any war or would not make any ceasefire. And so it's clear that we don't give any concrete timeline. It's okay.
But Mr. Zelenkyy, President Zelenkyy makes the opposite argument, doesn't he? He says that with a concrete timeline, then President Putin would know his days are numbered in terms of fighting Ukraine.
Yes, but President Putin won't give up. He still thinks he can win this war. And as long as he has any chance to continue the war, then he can hinder Ukraine to be member of NATO. And he will do anything or everything to do this. So I think it's all right to not have a clear timeline and have this ambiguity.
And can you understand, though, the Ukrainian frustration with this ambiguity?
Of course, I can understand. And we have to make a clear commitment to Ukraine that we want to have them in the NATO. And it makes sense. I am absolutely in favor of opening a path for Ukraine to come into NATO. But it must be some ambiguity and not some automatism behind this.
During the NATO summit, Germany announced a substantial arms package worth €700 million. Does this count as a security guarantee, which is something that Ukraine has been asking for?
I think it counts as something like a security guarantee because we provide a lot of weaponry, and this 700 million package is an addition to that what we already have given as Germany. We are the second biggest donator of weaponry. It is nearly €4 billion worth that we have provided as weaponry now. And this is some important means for Ukraine to survive and to be able to get back their country.
Germany is also committed to spending more money on its military and to sending 4,000 troops to Lithuania to strengthen NATO's border with Russia. Is the country prepared to actually go through and fulfil these obligations? Because there have been problems, haven't there?
Of course there are problems, and it's not easy. It's a very ambitious plan to have those 4,000 troops in Lithuania. You know, the infrastructure is not ready in Lithuania yet. And of course, also the 2% goal is also very ambitious. You know, in the last years in the Merkel government, we had 1.3% that we invested in NATO. So the 2% is a very huge step, and money is scarce in Germany, I can tell you. So these are ambitious plans. There is still resistance, even in our parliament, but we will manage that, I'm sure.
You say that the Lithuanian infrastructure is not ready. Are the German armed forces ready? You have had problems not only with procurement, but also with actually being able to deliver armed services anywhere.
You are totally right. That's also a problem. We must cut out our troops from our German troops that we have currently. We have to send them to Lithuania. We have to make clear how this is legally made. We have not yet the laws for that. So we have important tasks to be done in Germany to fulfill this promise.
Good talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Alexander Müller, who speaks on defence for the FDP group in the German Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you too.